Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shirley, and I will be your moderator this evening. I am excited to welcome Lee Tessler, Senior Consultant at Healthcare Leasing, Cirrus Consulting Group, and Jonathan R. Moffat, founder of Aligned Advisors, as our speakers this evening. They will discuss how to clear out potential hindrances impacting the growth and profit of your practice while leaving the stress of the process behind you. If you have any questions this evening, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A section. We will be answering questions live at the end of the webinar. Lee, Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for being with us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and launch one of our first polls tonight.
I'll just give a brief introduction about myself. Like I said, I'm Jonathan Moffat, founder of Aligned Advisors. I started working in dentistry about 20 years ago. In 2016, a client of mine, a dentist, actually approached me and asked me to help him start a DSO, a multi-location group. And so we bought our first office in October of 2016, and then grew that to 8 locations and just sold that last year. And in 2017 or 18, I think it was 2017, Henry Schein had asked me to be a part of their faculty for their Dental Business Institute, and that was amazing. I loved every moment of that, being able to help dentists look at their business plans and solve some of their biggest issues that they're facing so they can continue to grow and scale. So excited to share kind of what Lee and I are seeing in the industry and what we see and talk to dentists every single day, and what we're seeing as far as like, what is it that the practices that are really profitable and successful, what are they doing so that they are able to maintain those profits and continue to grow and scale? So, Lee, I think we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that your top competitors are doing to win. The number 1 is they're tracking and implementing key metrics daily. So number 2 is leveraging people, resources, and technology to maximize efficiencies. And then the third is they're following a plan. So we can go to the next slide. So what are those metrics? In May, I presented at Henry Schein's Thrive Live. We talked about practice analytics and how important it is to know the numbers and the metrics of your practice and to be reviewing those on a regular basis, ideally on a daily basis, and then how to implement those practice analytics and the financials of the practice. So kind of what's coming in generating revenue, and then how's that revenue being spent on the back end, and then actively monitoring those collections. And so when we kind of talk through that, what we're seeing and what we typically see with most practices that are very competitive and successful is they're actively monitoring and looking at, collections as a percentage of revenue, consistently looking at it, controlling their expenses, their overhead, looking at rent, which Lee's going to certainly get into. Your lease is one of the biggest expenses, and I'm sure Lee will get into kind of the current situation and how important it is to really stay on top of your lease, supplies, payroll. And so really paying attention to your bottom line, your net revenue. A lot of you probably heard the acronym EBITDA, right? So that gets used a lot, earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation and amortization, which is one of the metrics that accountants or groups who are maybe giving evaluation or determining profitability of your practice would use to determine how profitable the practice is. Looking at different revenue streams and what specializations you are going to either have in the practice or incorporate in the practice. And then obviously business liquidity. So a big thing that we saw over COVID was, a lot of practices were through COVID realized that maybe they didn't have as much cash reserves saved up. And so something that we noticed with practices that are really successful and that are typically have a really good are more successful than their peers and are in really good shape, typically have 3 to 6 months of expenses set aside, so that in the event that, and they just have that capital there to be able to use, whether it's to expand or if collections are low or something happens a bad month, it doesn't put the practice into a tailspin, especially if you're looking at wanting to grow or expand. I'm actually at a conference right now in Las Vegas as we speak. I was talking to a couple doctors earlier today, and this is a conversation we're having literally every day, which is it is becoming more and more difficult to have access to capital to expand your existing space, build out additional operatories. Maybe it's buying a second location or whatever that might be, or third location, expanding your operations. It's becoming harder and harder to have access to capital. One of the biggest issues that we're seeing banks deny loans for is liquidity, lack of liquidity. So making sure that you're really on top of your numbers, you're looking at it, and then you're also saving any excess cash flow and putting that aside. Because like I said, if you have any plans on expanding or growing, it is probably the number one reason why we're seeing loans get rejected right now is lack of liquidity. And then looking at just having an understanding of your overall profitability. Again, we talked about EBITDA. You can measure that from, you should know what your top line, what your expenses are, what your break even is. And again, looking and measuring those metrics on a regular basis. We look at business strategy and projections. When we look at overhead in general, again, I just kind of put up some rough numbers here. These should be fairly familiar to everyone on the webinar as far as overhead metrics. So for a single location, this is the doctors practicing in the practice, not associate driven, not absentee owner, but this would be like an active, dentist, a single location. This would be, your staff 25 to 30%, marketing 3 to 5, lab 8 to 10, supplies 6, office supplies 2, facilities cost is going to include, your rent and leasing 7 to 10%. So again, just to give that idea, if you're a single owner, single practice, you're the operator in the practice, you're going to want to shoot for your profitability to be 40%, so overhead to be 60%. If you are absentee owner, meaning it's an associate run practice or multiple practices, then you want that net profit to be, closer to 23, 24%. A number that probably a lot of you have heard really common, especially when it comes to EBITDA, is 20%, right? You want that number to kind of be right around 20% EBITDA. But even then, a lot of the groups, a lot of the banks are saying 20% is kind of the minimum. They want that to be more like, they really want to set more around 22, 23% from an EBITDA standpoint. But there's a lot of metrics. So one thing that, again, as we talk to dentists every day, even and as a business owner myself, and even with our group, our 8-location group, there's a lot of metrics to track. What do we pay attention to? And one thing that we know is that there's something that I always call analysis or paralysis by analysis, right? So if we give our team members, our office manager, our team members too many numbers and metrics to pay attention to, sometimes nothing gets done because it's too overwhelming. And so something to consider as kind of hopefully a little nugget or a little takeaway is what's your key metric? So, pick one metric or two metrics that you can track that will move the needle. So is it number of new patients? Like what key metric for your practice, if you were to just measure that one metric, would tell you, okay, we're making progress, we're profitable, we're moving in the right direction. And so just as an example, like, is it tracking number of new patients, number of active patients, number of patients in hygiene? Is it tracking production by provider? Is it tracking production per visit, production per patient? So what is that metric for you and your practice to know that if this number is growing, then we're growing, right? Is it top line revenue? Is it bottom line revenue, right? What's that metric? And really spend some time thinking about that. If you don't know, think about that. There's great tools like Jarvis with Dentrix and Dentrix Ascend that can help pull those numbers and those metrics out and make it even easier to identify. But spend some time figuring out what that is, and then I'll get to a couple of tools here in a little bit. What we will typically do even in our business is we have one metric per month. So every 90 days, we're identifying 3 metrics that we're going to work on for the next quarter, for the next 3 months. And then each month we focus on a key metric, and we're focusing on, defining what success looks like for that metric. How often are we going to be reviewing that metric? If we are consistently hitting that metric, when do we move the needle? And these are things that your top competitors, the practices that are out there, we have clients that have single locations doing 6, 7, we have a client doing $9 million a year out of one practice, one location, right? So these practices that are doing those kinds of numbers, these are what they're looking at. They have systems and processes in place. They spend the time training their staff and their team members, and they invest that time and those resources, and then they get that in response. So it's going to make it a little bit easier and feel like it's less overwhelming if you can identify a key metric to really focus in on, to focus on as a team, review it in your daily huddles, weekly, and then again, the idea would be that once you spend a month kind of focusing on it, not that you're going to let the rest of the stuff go, but like, this is really what we're focusing on. Again, hopefully you'll start to see the needle start to move. All right, so next is, let me go to the next slide. So leveraging people, resources, and technology to maximize efficiencies. So one thing that I spend a lot of time talking to doctors about, and if you look at some of the most successful people just in general, what they're really good at is only spending time on the things that only they can do, and then delegating everything else out to a team. And so this is a really good exercise that I go through, we have our clients go through, which is, what activities are you doing in your office that takes up your time? Just list out everything you're doing that takes up your time. Is it running payroll? Is it doing your financials? Is it, putting out fires with staff? Is it putting out fires with patients? Just what is everything that you're doing to spend that's taking up your time, that you're utilizing your time with? And then ask yourself, once you've listed that out, yes or no, are you the only one in the office that can do this activity? Yes or no? And then if the answer is no, if no, who could you delegate this activity to? Right. So Sandra was one of our office managers in one of our offices. So in this case, putting together a morning huddle meeting, again, this is probably a dumb example because a lot of the practice analytics software would actually put that together for you. But in this case, our office manager could do that for us, right? Or oversee that, make sure that's actually happening. And then, do you have a process in place for this person to take over this task? So that's, again, yes or no. If the answer is no, I'm going to give you guys another tool. And there'll be an opportunity for you to email if you want copies of these spreadsheets. We have all these tools and spreadsheets. Happy to send those to you if you'd like a copy of them. If the answer is no, we don't have a process, then again, there's another spreadsheet where you want to start tracking all the processes that you don't have clearly defined out and written out. And then we'll look at how you can do that, how you can create those systems and processes, which again, will now support Sandra to take that off of your plate. So the idea is that you want to eventually shift yourself into a situation as the business owner, as the doctor, as the leader, that you're only spending your time working on only the activities in your office that only you can do. And if you'll do that, you should have a highly efficient office. Your time will be utilized for the highest payoff activities. You'll have a better quality of life. You'll see massive amounts of progress and traction and moving forward. And again, the topic of this is, what are your top competitors doing to win, right? And that's kind of this is what they're doing. So again, as someone who talks to a lot of doctors who are highly successful, they're not perfect at this. But they realize and they recognize, hey, if I spend my time on doing all these other things that I could be delegating them to someone else, I'm never going to actually be able to focus on the high level items that are going to really move the needle, right? And for a lot of offices right now, overhead's out of control, expenses are through the roof, right? Net cash flow is down, and so if you had more time to focus in and look at why is that the case? Why is that out of skew? What are some tools that I could be sharing or implementing, or some training I could be giving my staff and my team, or having time to then focus in on strategizing around how do we bring down our overhead and then start to really focus on, moving the needle to build up the profitability. So again, this is leveraging people. So this is an example of tool you would use. So how can you best utilize the team members that you already have? Now, let's say you go through this example and it says, if no, who could you delegate this activity to? And there's no one there. You're like, oh, man, there's no one. I am that person. Well, then you'd want to write a goal. You'd want to make a goal. And again, we'll look at some 90-day goals here, worksheet here in just a minute. You'd want to make a goal that said, if there's enough of those, like I don't have someone, then you'd want to start looking for a resource, either temporary outsourcing to someone who could do that for you, or looking at maybe, hey, this next hire that I need to bring in and hire, there need to be someone who can help take a lot of this stuff off of my plate so I can shift my focus elsewhere. So that's leveraging people, leveraging resources and technology. Thanks. Yeah, that's perfectly perfect. Yep, you're right there. So there's been a lot of talk and conversation around ChatGPT as an example, right? So this is just the one I'm going to talk about. There's a lot of other AI opportunities, but AI is massive. It's gaining more and more control, or more and more traction in our industry, and in all the industries, especially dental. You know, there's companies out there that will do AI assisted, second opinions for radiograph reviews. The 3D printing technology is just getting insane. Right, I was at Thrive Live in May, and they had a company there that can 3D print a crown, and it's just amazing. The technology is getting there to where what I've been telling people is, like, with ChatGPT and AI and some of these things, like what's really cool is we're actually entering a phase of our practice, of our industry, where there's really no more excuses. Like, what I mean by that is, at the end of the day, because there's so many tools to support our team members to help them be successful, if it's not getting done, the only reason is because they don't want to do it. And if that's the case, then again, as a business owner, we know, okay, well, if clearly they don't want to do it, I've given them the tools and resources to be successful in this job. If it's not getting done, it's because they don't want to do it. So then we're faced with the opportunity to say, hey, look for someone else, or look at possibly replacing them or whatever. But for those of you who are not using ChatGPT in your practice, you absolutely should be. For those of you who aren't familiar or are using it, hopefully you're using it all the time. I use ChatGPT literally every single day. And so this was just an example. Hopefully you have in your practice roles and responsibilities spelled out. Again, this helps with the team members. So as you go through that list, that checklist, what's everyone spending their time with? A lot of times when we have, when our overhead is too high, in our case, our practices were in Southern California. And so in Southern California, you have to pay overtime, and we would always run into issues with overtime, which typically meant that people weren't being as efficient with their time. And a lot of times that meant that we had to maybe more clearly redefine their roles and responsibilities, because sometimes we had people doing multiple people doing the same job. And so if you don't have your job role responsibilities template, this is an example. I did this on ChatGPT. I literally went into ChatGPT. I said, write out a job roles and responsibility template. I'm a dental practice. I need to clearly define the roles for every job in my dental practice. And this is what it kicked out. Right. So this is completely free. It's 10 things, 10 questions, 10 options for them to fill out. You have your team members fill this out. You review it with them, review it with your office manager, make sure there's no overlap, make sure everyone clearly understands what they're doing. One of the really hot topics recently is, and those of you who are on here, you probably know, is hiring and retaining staff. Well, one of the reasons staff leave is because they don't feel like they're being utilized in their position, like their skill sets aren't being used. Maybe there's confusion. They're not really sure what their job is. And then if they go to a different job, and they're able to more clearly define, or more clearly able to teach, this is what your roles are, this is how we're going to utilize your skill set, then they feel like there's a better fit there. So again, ChatGPT, I just kind of listed out a couple things just to kind of show you guys, if you're not using this tool, start using it. If you don't want to use it, so again, this goes back to that prior slide, like, is this something only you can do? No. Get someone in your office who understands, who loves technology, who wants to learn. Get them on Instagram, there's all kinds of free training and tools around how to generate prompts. You can use this for marketing. You can use this for literally everything in your office. You can, except for the actual dentistry, you can use this tool to support you. So this is just one example. If we go to the next one, I actually did a video for our clients a couple months ago, back in February. ChatGPT was rolled out, I think in November. It's gained massive amounts of traction. So I just said, hey, the prompt was, you're you're one of the country's top dental consultants for dental practices. You have an expertise in helping offices run smooth and efficiently. What are the top systems or processes a successful dental practice should have? And this is what it kicked out. These are all processes that it said you should have, these systems and processes. So the reason I bring this up is because we get asked all the time if we have systems and processes that we can share with our clients, or they'll ask us, like, hey, do you have a process for that? Do you have a system for that? And the reality is, You can borrow someone else's system, you can borrow someone else's process, but it's not going to be yours. It's not going to fit your culture. It's not going to fit the way that you, as the clinical director, may want things done, right? So I think I put one in here. We can kind of skip down maybe to the next slide. I think actually it's 2 slides down. So again, these are more examples of systems. This is that spreadsheet that I was telling you about too, of how you should track. So we use this in our office. We track our processes on a spreadsheet, and it says, let's see, it's so odd. I see the screen very clearly. I don't know, is that a question for us on there, Lee? Or that chat?
Yeah, I'm just looking. Go on, you carry on.
Am I supposed to be seeing Lee Tessler's screen? It's not doing anything. Okay. Are you guys still, maybe can someone type in the chat or somewhere, are you still not seeing the screen?
I should hope that everybody's seeing the screen.
Give us a thumbs up. If not, we'll do a real quick just screen revisit. And if we can, this one, oh, this one's our, okay, gotcha. This one's our private chat. I see Brad Gilmer on here. Well, if you can't, I think everyone can see it. Okay. All right, cool. If you can't see it, shoot me an email. I think the information, yeah, Brad, great. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Brad. Thanks for the feedback. And if you missed some, just shoot me an email. We'll happy to send these to you.
Okay.
This is a spreadsheet that we use to track all of our processes. So you can see like the name of the process, the type, who created the priority, who was the owner, the date it was created. I'm not going to read all these. Where file link, where is the process? So where online can that process be found? But this is so important because in order to hire, train, retain top talent without it being a massive headache, right? What's one of the biggest things we say as business owners about hiring new people? It's time intensive, it's expensive, it costs money, it costs so much time, it's a headache. And so a lot of times we keep employees that we know we should get rid of, but we're keeping them on just because we don't want to go through the headache of letting them go. Well, what if you had a system where they sat down and watched training videos that trained them on your systems and processes that were already pre-recorded? What if they could go into a database and look at the systems and processes so they weren't asking you every 5 minutes, hey, doctor, where do I find this? Hey, where do we get this? Right? So again, the top offices out there are so dialed in. We have a client in Central California, one location, they do $9 million a year. He spends 30 days with his associates. He hired associates right at dental school, no prior experience, hires them right at dental school, pays them a daily rate for 30 days. They don't produce any dentistry for 30 days. He pays them a daily rate, so that money's gone. But by the time they're done, by their 3rd month, they're producing $100,000 a month, each associate. Okay, their systems are so dialed in. That doctor travels like 9 months a year, him and his spouse travel, because everything's dialed in that office, right? So systems and processes, you have to dial in. This is just an example of another example that we use in our firm. This is all our processes are documented this way. Again, you can go into ChatGPT. I think Lee, maybe the next slide is my ChatGPT process. Yeah, so went into ChatGPT. I said, create a perio maintenance clinical procedure for perio maintenance for a top tier dental practice that wants to offer best in class dental dentistry to their patients, and and this is what it kicked out. Now again, I'm not a dentist, so I'm just showing this as an example. So you'd want to look at this, and it's not perfect. Like, it's not going to do it exactly how you are, but it does come in and get pretty specific as far as so maybe it doesn't do it 100%, but it does 80%, 85%. The hardest part about creating systems and processes is just getting started. It's sitting down and being like, okay, where do I start? Okay, step 1, this step 2. But if you go into ChatGPT and you say, dial out this process, this is the process, spell it out for me step by step, and it does 85% of the work, and now all you have to do is go back in, read it, and make the corrections that you have in here. How much easier is that? How much less time would that take? And again, unless it's clinical, you should have your team, and even some of the clinical, you could have your hygienist help take the first crack at it, your assistant, right? But have your team support you to get this done and get it dialed in, and then make sure that you're visiting it and implementing it on a regular basis. So ChatGPT is a massive, massive tool. If you're not using it, you're absolutely going to be behind. All right, so let's see. I think, is there another? Let's see here, Lee. Yeah. So these are just some tools. Again, I'm happy to share these with you. This is like a 90-day success plan. So what's the 3 most important strategic planning action items for the next 90 days? Action items to build and lead your team, systems and processes you need to develop, 3 most important action items to become more profitable. So this is just helping you and your team get more specific on what areas to focus on so that you're focusing on the metrics that are going to move the needle. And again, this is what the top practices are doing, and they're following a plan. They create a plan, they're following a plan. I was just talking to a doctor just literally, 30 minutes before we jumped on this webinar, and he's got 3 practices in East Texas. And he was asking me, like, how long does it take to turn around a practice from being profitable to not profitable to profitable? And I just said, look, and he was asking me about different practices and what he should buy. And I said, you have to get so clear on your model and what you're doing, and then you roll out the plan to support the model. But it all has to start with your personal plan. What personally are you trying to do? What do you need from your practice to support your personal goals and your personal life, and get clarity around that? And then you have your practice, your business, your practices, whatever that looks like, has to support and feed directly into what you personally want to get out of your practice. And that is probably one of the biggest missing pieces that we see is when we talk to doctors, is they talk about how they don't have a plan, or they haven't really sat down. As a business owner, as entrepreneurs, it's easy for us to get stuck in the weeds in the day-to-day of our business, especially with as stressful as it is, and staff asking for raises and overhead going right and feeling we're losing money. It's really hard, but we have to take a step back and really get clear around what is it we as a business owner really want, and then put that plan in place, and then have that plan be in alignment with our practice. So again, those 3 things were track and implement key metrics, leverage people, technology, and to maximize efficiencies in your office, and then follow a plan. And then, like I said, and happy to answer any questions. Probably do that here at the end. And then if you want a copy of any of the slides or any tools that we have, we share everything. We're happy to share anything and everything. If you want to hop on a call to chat about anything specific that's going on in your practice, or any piece of information or tools we can give you, please feel free. There's my phone number and email down below. Happy to talk to any of you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so Cirrus Consulting Group, who are we? We've been kind of representing the dental community for over sort of 10 years now, representing Schein's clients for over 10 years. We've been in business for over 25 years. I mean, essentially, we're a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm founded by dentists for dentists, really for the reason that landlords were taking advantage of the healthcare and dental tenant. As some of you probably well know, it's an expensive business to enter into, but as Jonathan talked on, it can be very profitable business. So since inception, we've negotiated over 12,000 dental and medical specific lease negotiations. And what makes us unique, so we do everything in-house. We have an in-house legal and leasing team comprised of real estate attorneys, some with a background in healthcare, some that we've actually hired from the landlord side as well. So in terms of myself, I've been at Cirrus for nearly 5 years now, one of the senior consultants, and I deliver a lot of the sort of continuing education seminars across the country. We also lecture at most of the major dental conventions, the Yankee, the Pacific, the Greater New York. We really work with dentists nationwide. We also pay for a lot of proprietary data in terms of sort of rental rates and vacancies, and actually drill down into some of the particular buildings depending on where you are. I mean, again, if we want to look more specific to your individual situation, then we can certainly talk offline later in terms of understanding, the type of space that you're in and the current sort of rental rates and vacancy rates. We do have access to a lot of that proprietary data. right now what we're seeing is still there's still a lot of push. A lot of the sort of downtown office spaces are still in a kind of hybrid model where people are not back to work the whole time. But from a tenant perspective, there's definitely, dentists are, one of the best tenants in the country. They have the lowest default rate. They technically, stay at their space for a minimum of 22 years, I think, statistically. So there's plenty of leverage and opportunity in terms of when it comes to negotiating and renegotiating the lease. So what is a lease? One of the questions that I always ask in normally in an in-person seminar, but whilst webinar, I'm not going to wait for everyone's answer. Essentially, it's a check, and it's probably the largest check that you're going to write in your business commercial life. Even if we just take $5,000 rent per annum, $60,000. Like I said, if you stay for 10 or 20 years, you're looking at $600,000 over 10 years and 1.2 million over 20 years. And that doesn't even include any sort of rent escalations, tax, maintenance, insurance. So, it's really one of the biggest checks you're going to write in your professional career. And that's why it's extremely important for you to just understand why that lease and the office location is so important. Essentially, like we talked about, it's extremely expensive to build out a practice. It can be very expensive to move, can be time consuming, can be difficult. And also the lease is a big part of evaluation when you come to sell a practice. Again, the location, the foundation of your practice is so key. Yeah, you may be able to sell some of the goodwill, your equipment, but if somebody's actually at, unless you're in a really dilapidated or, an area where someone doesn't want to be in, majority of you will be in a location where they're buying the actual practice itself from the community and being in that same location for over 20, 30 years. So somebody doesn't really want to come in and then have to move or be forced to move. And then also the landlord is the one that has to give consent to transfer the lease. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's why it's so extremely important, the office lease itself. One of the questions I get quite a lot in terms of, buying versus leasing, again, we don't have any horse in a particular race. Yes, we represent tenants, but we work with a lot of clients that own their own real estate as well. If you own the real estate, it requires a larger upfront investment. You become your own landlord, so you don't have to answer anyone. You have much greater flexibility on the space, and then you're set on that particular location. If something changed, then you can't just move. Whereas if you do lease, there's a smaller upfront payment and a greater working capital towards building out the practice and the flexibility to relocate or expand. So, the common denominator between leasing and buying, you still need an office lease. Even if you own the real estate that you practice from, you still need to have a lease in place to separate the building from the practice for, again, number of reasons, tax reasons. Even if you want to sell the practice and keep the real estate, that potential incoming buyer, they're going to still need a lease to finance the purchase over a period of time. There's a number of legal provisions within a lease, and again, just for the interest of time, we're not going to touch on all of these. Demolition, relocation, they're obviously some of the big red flags, and there's plenty of demolition clauses in some of the downtown areas in the cities. That doesn't mean that you can't move or you can't sell the practice. There's certain things that can be done to enhance the provision itself, even if you can't remove a demolition clause per se. But I think what's important, if you can take away anything from tonight, is a lot of you will look at the lease, you'll know roughly what you're paying each month and for how long, and then the next 30, 40 pages will probably go in a drawer and won't be looked at for a long time until the lease comes up for expiry. Where we see a number of the problems are in the legal language and the provisions that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So a couple of exercises just for you to know, and always make sure you know the critical dates. If you do lease your space, when does that lease expire? Is there an option to renew? Do you have any additional options? Landlord unlikely will probably say to you that the option's coming up, because they're more than happy for you to actually miss that deadline, because it just gives them more leverage. They know that you're very unlikely you're going to be able to move your practice within 6 months, and you're going to probably be signing something that they put in front of you. Are your options transferable? Are you personally liable even after sale? We talked about some of the demolition and relocation rights and the state of your estate. Again, these are just some of the things that you should just know. And if you do own the building, what's the state of your estate? Who owns the building? Is it in your personal corporation? Who runs it? Are you paying rent to yourself? Many dentists I speak to who do own the real estate and the practice, they just simply don't know that they actually need a lease, and why that is beneficial for a number of reasons that I touched on before. If there is somebody has an accident at the practice, say slip and fall, you want them to be coming after you to suing the practice, rather they come after your separate corporation and not the business. So again, the sort of myth is that you don't need a lease if you own the building, but I can assure you, for a number of reasons, it's extremely important and to have that in place, and something to think about, especially if you're coming up to the sort of transition time of your career. So some of the lease terms to be careful when transition planning. We're going to talk about the assignment clause in a little bit more detail. Rental rate increases. If you are coming up to transition, then rental rate increases may not be the biggest downside. Not that you want to be paying more rent, but if you're looking to sell the practice in the next 5 years, of course we want to make it attractive for any buyer to come in, but at that stage you really just want to be able to transfer the lease and be released from any sort of personal or future continuing liability. You don't want any consideration language. Again, we'll touch on that in a minute, which is probably more important for you at that stage. So again, we're going to just talk through one particular example, one kind of technical, where the assignment clause, and the assignment clause essentially it allows you to transfer the lease to another personal party, normally in conjunction with the sale or acquisition of the practice. So as I said, the transfer to another party or tenant in the lease for the remainder of the lease term. This is how it's defined, and protects the dentist at time of sale, allows for smooth and clean transition, and relieves the doctor from any further responsibility in the lease. So I'm going to give you a quick 30 seconds just to have a read over this particular provision, which is, again, it's found in 75% of dental leases. And this is something that, that I look and I review leases, whether you are an existing tenant or even if you're looking to acquire a practice. I had a client on today that's looking to take over a practice and been handed a lease. And, they spoke to me and said, Lee, I want to know what I'm actually getting into, and what liabilities, what risks am I going to be taking on? So we'll just touch on this in a. So as you can see here, so it says, if the tenant wishes to assign or sublet the lease premise, it should first receive the consent from the landlord. So you have to have consent from the landlord, which is normal. Any landlord is not just going to let you transfer the lease to any sort of Tom, Dick, or Harry. They want to know who's going to be in their space. But essentially, what they can say is, in here, for example, and there's three reasons or three kind of provisions that the landlord can say. One, they can just approve the request for you to assign the lease. Two, they can simply decline your tenant's request to assign the lease. And three, they can actually terminate the lease agreement just for you asking permission to transfer the lease. They can actually terminate the lease agreement. So in what we call a termination provision, which is a huge red flag. As you can see a little bit further down, one of the other conditions is landlords shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term for the greater of the current market rent for the lease premises, or 15% greater than the current rent. So I had a client that was in Florida, $2 million practice, looking to sell the practice, had a number of buyers, and landlord said, if you want to sell the practice, then no problem, but I'm going to increase the rent by 15%. Now, a lot of the I's and been dotted and T's have been crossed at that stage, and suddenly the new buyer finds out that the lease is going to be increased by 15%. First thing that buyer did was knock his price down by 15%. It actually gets worse. Should tenant receive from assignee or subtenant any rental income, any cash form of consideration in connection with the assignment, the difference between the annual rental rate and such rental income, cash goods, other considerations shall be paid directly to the landlord within 30 days of receipt from the tenant. So again, this is what we define as consideration language or proceeds of sale language, which to me is ridiculous. The landlord shouldn't, have any access to all the sort of blood, sweat, and tears that you've put into your practice over 20, 30 years. Landlord will say, well, my space, my building has helped, the success out of your practice. Now, in this scenario, if you're paying $5,000 a month, annually $60,000 a year, and let's just say you sold your practice for $500,000, landlord is asking for $440,000 just to assign the lease. And we had a situation where, like I said, a client who was selling his for $1.2 million, and he was out. He was done, and he had this kind of language in his lease, and he cut a check for $263,000 to the landlord. He wanted out. He wanted to take his money, and he was willing to forego over $200,000 just to get the landlord to approve the assignment. Like I said, without the actual space, without the permission from the landlord, then what have you got? You've got your charts, you've got your goodwill, and maybe equipment. But if you don't have the place to practice, then that's a huge liability. And then finally, even if you are able at this point to get the landlord to consent to the transfer of the lease, it says here, notwithstanding any of the landlord's consent, the tenant shall not be released from its obligation under the lease, shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignee. So essentially, it's saying, okay, we'll approve the transfer, but you're still on the hook for your buyer, right? We don't know this buyer. So if anything was to happen, you're still liable. Now, in some cases, this can happen. We've seen cases where you may have to give 1 or 2 years of liability. Best case scenario is we release you completely from any future liability. But what we don't want is you to be on the hook forever and ever, amen, right? Because we had a doctor that he sold his practice and he was retired, and he got a call 3 years later when he's on the beach, and landlord said, "Hi, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but unfortunately your buyer has taken on too much debt and during COVID, etc., and gone bankrupt, and he's 3 months in arrears of rent, and there's another 7 years of tenancy expenses to be paid." Now, the last thing this dentist wants to do is go back and start practicing dentistry. That was a huge cost for that dentist. So as you can see, just on one provision, which is found in 75% of dental office leases, there's 5 or 6 red flags in this one provision. And the cost of this mistake, the inability to sell the practice, having to absorb significant increase in rent, you're remaining a guarantor beyond practice sale, paying the landlord a portion of sale, could be anywhere between 250,000 to 750,000 liability. So, and we can touch on some questions after. Just a couple more slides I wanted to talk about. So this is a slide that I like to show in a lot of my presentations. We actually got this from the landlord side, somebody that works for us now, what we call the sort of tenant lease cycle. So as you can see from the blue, we recommend, if your lease is coming up for expiry, we recommend to start that process at least 24 months before expiry. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. The main reason is we want to have as much time and leverage to negotiate an extension, a renewal, or whatever we want to do. Even if we have no intention of leaving, we want to stay. The longer time threshold that we have, the more leverage we have. Even if we don't want to move, we still have the time and strategy. We can still say, there's other spaces across the road, etc., and there's opportunities for us to move. Now, landlord, they want to get you down to the sort of orange and red kind of level. They want to delay as long as possible, because, like I said, they know that when you get into that sort of 6 months prior to the expiry, the chances of you moving is going to be pretty slim. If you're going to find a space, build out a new practice, could take 12 to 18 months. Now, many of you may have options that, let's say, you have to give a 6 months notice. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to wait for the 6 month mark to give them the notice that you want to extend. You just want to make sure that you have wrapped everything up before that time comes in. So in terms of, how is Cirrus, how have we been so successful for over 25 years and, proudly looking after Henry Schein's clients for over a decade now? Well, the reason that we are is because we have, strategy and a process, and a successful winning process. One of them, what we do is we gather all the documentation, all the information. So if you have an existing lease, or if you have a new practice that you're looking, you have a letter of intent, anything regarding to the lease, we want to gather all the information and documentation, understand all those critical dates. And then, we'll spend a good time with you to understand your practice and career goals. What stage of your career at? Are you mid-career? Are you looking to coming up to retirement? So we want to have a good understanding so that we can align the lease with your strategy to where you are in your working life. If you're just starting a practice, then some of the sort of personal guarantees or some of those liabilities, if you just come out of dental school, there's not going to be a huge not problem, but you've probably got quite a lot of debt and at that stage of your career. So it's not going to be, you're going to be looking at, what am I paying? What are the rents? What are the additional expenses? So, there's a number of high, medium, low priority items that we want to try and achieve. So once we've kind of understood your practice and career goals, and we've reviewed the office lease, we complete our market research. So, have we worked with the landlord before? Do we know, have we done any other negotiations in the building? What are the other vacancy rates like? What are the other availabilities, in the area? So we've developed the strategy, and all of these things from 1 to 5. What we haven't done at this point, we haven't even picked up the phone to the landlord. Now, what I would say is, a lot of you, and a lot of times when I lecture, I'll get a phone call and people will have their lease. They'll be looking at it tonight. Have I got this? Have I got that provision? And they phone up their landlord and, start panicking. Don't do that. We want to ensure what's in the lease and understand it before we start, being concerned. I mean, there is certainly reason to be concerned if you have some of the language we talked about in the lease, but there is a process and there is a strategy to be successful. And one of the reasons is to educate the landlord and explain why there's certain things and what makes you different from maybe a nail salon or another tenant. Like I said to you, you have one of the lowest default rates in the country. You stay in your space on average for over 20 years. You're becoming kind of like the anchor tenant now, where we get phone calls all the time looking for any new builds, that any spaces are available. Can we fill it with a healthcare professional, because they know that they're going to be good tenants. So we spend some time on the financial, the economics, and the negotiations, and then we complete a final review and execute the lease to make sure that is consistent with the lease that we've negotiated. So there is a certain method for our success. One of the things I just wanted to share with you, we do have what we call a critical dates and risk analysis, whereby we would spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease for any sort of traps, any liabilities, areas of concern. We get on a call, like I said, just to go over our findings and discuss a sort of strategy, a treatment plan going forward. Now, this does have a $2,000 value, and for part of Henry Schein and part of our sort of business solution arrangement, we can offer that complimentary to all of those that have attended tonight. It is on a first come first served basis. So I think Shirley, if you can put some of the other polls up as well, but if you are interested in a complimentary consultation, not just with me, but I know Jonathan as well, if you're interested in some of the slides and a little bit more detailed conversation, then I would strongly urge you to take up this offer. Like I said, it's a $2,000 value normally. And if you have a copy of your lease or you're looking to start a practice, then it's really beneficial. It's a first come first served basis, and my email address on the screen. And then we'll sort of jump in. We've got about 5 minutes for some questions. If anyone has any questions, you can use the chat feature. Don't know if there's any questions. Don't be shy.
Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you both. And yes, we invite anyone who has questions to please enter them into the Q&A chat. We'd love to have a conversation with you. So please go ahead and enter those while the poll is still up.
Everyone goes shy now.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes people if may want to talk about a personal situation themselves, then we'd be more than happy to, reach out. These are direct lines and emails. We can spend a bit more time within your specific situation if there's no more questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Well, thank you both for a wonderful presentation this evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight. We did record tonight's webinar, and we'll email the recording out sometime in the next week. We would appreciate your feedback via our survey that will pop up on your screen shortly. And again, we thank you all for joining us this evening.